Okay, so thank you for the handful of us that are here, our live audience, which is I think a dozen of us. I know you all, but in case you're like me, I mean, what are we all jokingly calling it, COVID brain, where you're like, what? I'm Nanette Macy-Junes, the executive director and the CEO of the Columbus Museum of Art, and I welcome you to Michael Hall's final official lecture in this auditorium as our adjunct curator of folk and self-taught art. Now, I do not believe this is the last time that Michael will speak in this auditorium. I don't believe that. But I do know that this is his last conversation and presentation as in his official role as adjunct curator, and he is retiring this month. He's been with us a very long time. I didn't go look up dates, Michael. You and I looked up the dates, and then I've immediately forgotten them. But my relationship and friendship and as a colleague with Michael goes back to 1990. I had gone to work, I'd worked here before that, but then I'd gone off to work in Memphis, Tennessee at the Dixon, and I came back. And I came back in a moment when we were organizing an Elijah Pierce exhibition, Elijah Pierce Woodcutter, which is an extraordinary exhibition that we did. And I came back as the American curator. And Michael was already on board as one of the essayists and one of the consultants for the exhibition. And my colleague, who was in charge of the exhibition, was doing something, and Michael had arrived, and she goes, go up there and go get Michael Hall. He's up there. And I said, okay, so I go up there, and I introduced myself, and I started to introduce myself, and Michael Hall said, you are that woman that works on Charles Birchfield. And I said, and why would you know that? You are the guy that works on Elijah Pierce. And he goes, I do, but I'm also very interested in the American scene. I know a lot about the American scene. I said, oh, all right. So that started quite a long friendship, and as we've become very good friends, but as colleagues. Michael went on from working on, you know what, Michael, if I had brought my phone, but I didn't, because I have actually the list in my phone of all the exhibitions. So Michael started as, consulting, doing guest curator work for us, being essays for us, and then once I became director, Michael did become our official adjunct curator of folk and self-taught art. But as always, he was my co-curator for the Charles Birchfield show, which was one of the great highlights of my curatorial career. But as director, we have done so much. I mean, Michael, in the years since we asked him to be an official adjunct curator, I think has done 7 or 8 exhibitions, and extraordinary ones. Diane is here. We did the Open Borders exhibition. We have done just wonderful projects with Michael, and the pièce de résistance is upstairs. It's absolutely the pièce de résistance. It shows us what we have achieved in terms of our collection and how Michael's work so seamlessly connects fine art and modernism to the folk art and self-taught artists, and how there is a conversation going there. And this exhibition, and I think after we finish this recording, we're going to go upstairs and walk through together, and Michael's going to do a little bit of a tour with recording that. So, Michael, without further ado, it's you, sir. It's your turn.
The unmasking of the curator. What she didn't tell you is that they probably in the future will refer to me as the COVID curator of folk art, which is to say there's no vaccine. So he's back. He's going off into the sunset, but he never quite goes away. So I prepared a lecture that really attempts to sort of tie a bow around the work that Nanette and I started so long ago. Actually, we've mounted 12 exhibitions. I've been here since '07 in official capacity, but of course that fateful day when we met over the subject of Elijah Pierce, I think was probably the day that we actually gave birth to the Birchfield show that would follow some years later. So we were always one project out, always one project on down the road, which is probably the way museum practice needs to be anyhow. It takes a lot of time and a lot of preparation to put anything together. And when I finish here today, I'd like to invite you all to walk through the exhibition with me, because this exhibition has been at least the 13 years that I've been here, since '07, to formulate and to be able to present in the first place. So that's really looking down the road a decade, but the exhibition that you're going to see was actually a charge that Nanette gave me when I signed on. She said, I would like for you to build us a folk art collection, but of a very special sort. I'd like it to be a folk art collection that in some way addresses our modernist collection, which is of long standing and of which we are quite proud. If folk art is to have utility in this institution under her direction, the premise was that it had to be hooked up to something else, which put us on a curious path, because it means that my job, in the best sense, wasn't a kind of tunnel vision about folk art. It was always folk art in a larger conversation. And that lived in our imaginings all this time. We've actualized it in the galleries. So let me get my pointer here and we will embark. I've decided to use a PVC pointer here today, simply because we've had very bad luck with those laser pointers. They don't read on any filming or videotaping that's going on for an exhibition. And they plan to use this tape, I hope, in multiple situations, and they can cut and dice and fit it all together to do Zoom lectures, they can do docent planning, they can do public relations, because this show's actually been up since this year began, and it will continue on into the fall, late fall, I think. So there'll be plenty of exposure, but the point is I never had the opportunity to step up here and really share this exhibition. So you all sort of sit on the front lines of what I hope is a kind of ripple effect as the thinking behind this exhibition that goes beyond, in many ways, the objects themselves, spills over into a utility where this community and hopefully a larger American art community can find the use for this show that we think is built into the very architecture of the show itself. So, I need to start out, as always, with a bit of a recap. Some of you have been through this before and some of you have not. But I think we can bring those lights down a tad and maybe go to the slides. Now, some of you have seen this little synopsis of mine, but I still fall back on it because the exhibition upstairs can't be understood without some penetration into the view that I have of what art is for, all the big stuff, all the scary, sort of intimidating stuff. And so I like to try to simplify that idea or that vision into a set of graphics and little illustrations that maybe can just get us there real quickly. If you've been through the extended version of this before, it's repetition. If not, hold on. This is the way it works. One more time, we go back to the beginning. And in the beginning, of course, we inhabited caves, or so we're led to believe. And so it was that in those caves we made marks. And you notice I'm picking a very particular term here. We made marks. They call it prehistoric art, they call it cave art. It has lots of names in the history books. But my point is, before it was art, it was simply a mark. Much like graffiti, such marks essentially say, I am here now. These are self-affirming, self-declaring marks. And human beings have been making these in lots of ways over a lot of time. But we stumble across these marks, we of another time and in another place, and we ponder them. And we get excited, we make up stories about them, we try to contextualize them. Anthropologists give us some insight into what they are, but they remain marks until something else transpires. And that something else seems to be a kind of an engagement of an audience somewhere, not necessarily the audience that was the audience of community around the original mark maker, but some audience somewhere takes a hold of these marks and assigns them meaning. And the meaning has to do with an understanding of them as more than marks, and we start to revere them, and put them under the catch-all term art. My point here is that art is a collective and communal enterprise, and we are quite fixated, most of us, on the idea of the lonely artist in the garret struggling against all odds and making art while the world didn't notice. My counter to that is that person exists, and that person does make marks, maybe in isolation, and the world doesn't notice. But sometimes the world does notice, and when the world notices and enough momentum builds to recontextualize those marks and distinguish them as art, then art took place, and not before. So we're fond of saying that art speaks, and that was, in a way, a kind of a motto for this institution for a while. But I've always sort of been skeptical of that, because I've never been able to walk into a museum and really believe that these rather mute and peculiar things on pedestals and hanging on the wall are screaming at me in any way whatsoever. It takes my engagement, and the conversation begins with me, and the response and the context and understandings ensue as we engage. And if I'm right, art making is emphatically a social, communal, and cultural enterprise. It is not a private enterprise. And that means that art making is ongoing. And my fondest hope for this exhibition upstairs is that as you, the audience, walk through this exhibition and generate the conversations, art making is ongoing, and art making takes place, and you are a part of that art making process. And if you don't wander through, and if you don't engage, and if you don't speak, nothing happened. And so that means that art is not quite as durable and ineffable as we once thought. It's actually rather fragile, transitory, and always in need of that extra little boost where this business of culture comes in. And I've made this little diagram to really reinforce this idea of mine, that it's a cultural enterprise, and what holds it in place is a certain gravity, much like what we associate with the sun in these typical models of the solar system. Over here on the far side, we have that sun, and it burns in the middle, and it exudes incredible power. But that's the power that's collected of all that's going on in the heavens for that sun. But it's also, in the art sense, all that goes on for us as a community, as a culture, as a society. And it is we who extend these rings of gravitational tug that holds all of it in place and makes meaning out of all of it. And so I've tried to sort of set up some genres of art and give them orbits around this sun of ours. And we got public art in there pretty close, and we understand Mount Rushmore, and we love it, and it holds a place in our solar system. Academic art, yeah, sure, we know where Michelangelo fits in, or we think we do. Classical art, going all the way back into Egypt, into Greece, we understand. And it has an orbit, as does folk art, which has a rather eccentric orbit, but nonetheless in pretty close to the sun. Modern art loves to think of itself as liberated and free and somehow disengaged or disconnected. Not so. We made it, and we hold it in place, and it exists by our leave. And I don't think we can get too carried away with that idea and start feeling sort of this is a superpower, but collectively it is the superpower that creates the gravity that's holding all this in place. Now, more importantly, in the 20th century, we had this business of so-called primitive art. And there was a moment when we did a kind of magical thing and roped in a bunch of stuff that had been just stuff, just marks, and reclassified it as art and set it into an orbit. The term primitive art, of course, is in disrepair right now because the assumption is that primitive people made this primitive art, and that's incorrect. But the wonderful stuff that the ethnographers and the anthropologists brought forward was culled over by the art community, by us, and works within that corpus were pulled out and isolated and set up in an orbit, the orbit for primitive art. And more recently, we have a contemporary counterpart. They call it outsider art. the art that's made by people presumably cut off from the world, people who live in prison or people who live in the prisons of their own psychosis or their own disabilities. And we indulge ourselves the vanity of thinking that this material is of isolation, represents isolation, and its cut-offness, if you will, is somehow an aesthetic dimension. I would argue not so. I think like all marks, we find a place for it, we give it a name, and we locate it within our system, within our gravitational spheres, and it becomes yet another thing in an orbit around us. We've got the art of the insane, indicated down here as some kind of a comet that flits in and sails past and goes off into places we don't understand, but returns on a regular basis. And maybe so. Maybe it's an interesting way to look at this galaxy I'm describing. And Sunday painting, yeah, not really held in very tight. Might not even be art. Maybe like Pluto, we downgraded and it isn't really a planet. Maybe it's just an asteroid or something. But it's still held in place, and we keep it there because we somehow need it and because it somehow fits into this scheme. So I like this diagram, even though in many ways it seems to argue against some classical understandings of art history and what art is and the meaning of art. I think if you'll hold this map in close, it'll work for you pretty well. It works for me. And so the Columbus Museum of Art in 2007 asked me to come and work on this idea of folk art, which really meant, can you create an orbit for it? Can you find enough mass to put it into a space that will circle around the sun of this community and circle in an orbit that's useful to the state of Ohio, maybe to American culture, but certainly to the city of Columbus? And I said, I think I can, but of course it's a kind of interdisciplinary project, and it's going to mean I'm going to need a sort of wider access to your museum. What are we hooking this up to? What do we already have in orbit that would make any sense for us to set folk art into an orbit around? And of course, modern art seemed like the reasonable answer, and Annette was quick with that. And both of us, I think, had the background to sort of understand that crossover space, because we were fond of Charles Birchfield and we were fond of Elijah Pierce, and we shared some sensibilities and some apprehensions, maybe some misapprehensions about what all this was. But it became the mandate that I started to work on. And so we began on a journey, and I like these little kid footprints. They're my latest addition to my marks of my cave hands to sort of talk about the genesis of all of this, and that we are in many ways at an infancy for the kind of thinking that I think the current show demands. But the current show has been mounted for this community and really in recognition of this decade-and-a-half long project that the director and I have engaged in. And I call it Folk Art Road Trip, Travels with Modernism's Utility Infielder. And for those of you who hate sports metaphors in museum exhibition titles, I'm fully sympathetic. But I could do nothing else, and I could do no better. Because the utility infielder is an interesting idea. The utility infielder is somebody who probably isn't, quote, good enough to really make the first string, but you can stick them in a pinch if somebody gets hurt. And they can play shortstop, or they can play first base, or they can play third base. They usually don't bat very well, so you don't put them in the lineup because they don't hit home runs. At least that's the assumption. Doesn't mean they can't get lucky now and then if they actually have to make it to offense, but they're defensive players. And I think folk art plays a defensive role in the story of modernism, and we're going to explore that. And I don't think it's necessarily bad. I'm just suggesting that the deeper we probe this exhibition and the deeper we probe what will be right in front of us, and I hope self-evident upstairs, is that it's modern art, in a sense, that created folk art as a kind of a subsidiary. And they plugged this material in as a kind of utility infielder. The folk art that we have found and invented and pulled near and dear is the art that's had utility for us. And the utility has always been in terms of its support role for the modern art that we ourselves are busy making. And let me put it this way. And those of you familiar with my politics and my worldview understand that I endlessly find myself conflicted between participating in a kind of vertical model that's very much the sort of elitist in me, and then the horizontal model, which is very much the populist in me. And that modern art often finds itself sort of in a vertical stack. And the higher up that stack any art form or any art project or any artwork ends up being, the more risky and the more fragile the place within the structure. And so anytime you've got, in an architectural sense, something that's going up, it's always nice to have something that goes out and down. And this is what they did with Notre Dame when they put up the flying buttresses. They stopped that thing from falling in on itself. And the flying buttresses, you see, reach out. And these are the stabilizers. I would call it a kind of an outrigger. And the outrigger, if you're familiar with the canoes of the Hawaiian Islands, they've got the canoe, but it's risky, it's narrow, and it sits in rough waters. But if you put an extension out from it and put a float at the other end of the extension, you can keep that thing from capsizing, and you can go anywhere you need to go. So our utility infielder gets called in as the outrigger for modernism, straight across for 100 years now. And that's what this exhibition is set to investigating. Traveler's Advisory. This is simply to talk about the oversimplifications that accompany maps of every sort. So the sights and sounds along the path mapped out for you here are presented to compete for your attention and to inspire your active engagement. The art all around you in this exhibition is still a work in progress. It requires both the fresh seeing and the focused cultural imagination of its viewers to affirm and sustain its identity as art. Here's your map, and this is where we're going to be going. The exhibition will start here, and what I've done in this graphic is really kind of color code the enterprise. And so the dark blue here is the stream of modernism, and blue remains the code for modern in the geography we're going to move through. The red indicates the path of folk art. The reaching hands, of course, are the modernists looking for a little bit of stability and a little bit of reinforcement and a little bit of security. And so they reach. And they reach because there's a flash of some kind of an inspiration, so we fall back on the light bulb as the symbol for that flash of inspiration or recognition that we call creativity. And so as we go through the galleries, everything on your right, you're walking this way, is going to be from the world of folk or grassroots or self-taught or outsider art. Everything on your left, in blue, is going to come to us from the world of fine art or modern art in the best sense. And so I've simply broken this up with the color code to talk about what we're going to do and to give you a general map, again, having made a disclaimer about the fallibility of generalized maps. But we've got 3 phases to look at here, and I think this reasonably does break down. I'm not the first curator to have tried to compartmentalize all of this in terms of some time frames, but we are looking at a history here, and so we are looking at a way of being able to walk through time and place to get a sense of our subject across time and across space. Ready, set, go. Here's our modernists in phase 1, most of them known to you, but I want to preface this by saying all of the modern artists from each of the phases that I've selected for this exhibition, one way or another has some kind of a connection to the idea of folk, or in a larger sense, an idea of primitive art, because this comes hand in glove with the whole project of modernism, and it's fully a modern invention. So in our earliest phase here, from say 1910 through 1930, we have artists like Elie Nadelman, who was acutely aware of grassroots art, popular art, folk art, if he wanted to call it that, and as a European, had actually collected folk art material in Poland and Germany before he even came to this country. where he simply discovered American folk art and kept on building his collection. Over half of the artists that I've selected for the modern section here actively collected or engaged with folk art in some very immediate and direct way, and we can talk about it, and it's all in the label copy. We've got extensive label copy in this exhibition. I warn you ahead of time, if you don't like to read, you're going to miss some of it. If you do, you're going to spend some time in those galleries. But there are other artists here whose connection to folk art is not going to be perhaps quite as direct, but there will be a connection. Nadelman, we understand, of course, was in this, and he collected, and his respect for and his curiosity about grassroots marks as art was of long standing. And he ultimately, with his wife Viola, formed a large enough collection that they started their own museum in Riverdale, New York, and opened it up to the public. And it was called something like the Museum of Folk and Peasant Arts. And people in that early time were interested in what it was that Mr. Nadelman was collecting. David Smith, on the other hand, you would say, oh, come on, Michael, this is a hardcore cubist, he never looked at anything. But it's not exactly true. His dealer in New York City through most of his career was a very interesting doyen of the art world whose name was Marion Willard. And Marion was a deep believer in folk art, and at least once a year, for all the years that Smith was in her gallery, mounted a folk art show in her New York gallery. And so it's impossible to believe that David Smith never saw this material. And I was just in the galleries and I remarked to Pat, and by the way, I take a second here to acknowledge Pat, my wife. As a part of all of this, we walked this road together, and as collectors and curators in our own minds and in our own world, there's a lot of consensus and a lot of collaboration that went on here. And so Pat is in this, and we were upstairs just a few minutes ago, and I pointed to the David Smith, and right over here on the other side, just facing that David Smith, there's a very curious constructed wooden whirligig in a big vitrine. I said, Pat, look, the David Smith and the whirligig are having a very serious conversation. And it's because folk artists figured out this business of found objects all a long time ago. And David Smith figured it out subsequently. And of course, a lot of artists from his spawn were great at putting this and that together and framed in what was called the junk yard aesthetic of found object sculpture. But Smith was in there early. But when you look at that whirligig, glance over at the David Smith, and something will snap. And again, I would encourage you to understand that you, walking through this gauntlet, are the art maker. And so you are asked on one hand to sort of look at the modern works and find connections that you want to find. Some will be better than others. Some will make these connections more easily. Some will invent some very interesting connections that perhaps have not even occurred to curators and connoisseurs up until this point. But the real point is that something is happening here, and you are, if not the mediation, you are actually the broker in this conversation, which is why the admonition early on was be engaged. You know, this is not an armchair sport, this is a contact sport. And so I just was interested that this late in the game, I'm standing between the whirligig and the David Smith, and something happens. Something within my understandings, and something that pertains absolutely to what I know about David Smith, and certainly what I know about that whirligig. So there's a lot of discovering to be done in the galleries. But here's our modernists. I would indicate that that Flanagan was a great admirer of folk and primitive art. Nadelman was a collector. We'll walk through some of the individual dispositions of these people to get a picture of how this works. But in general, the three things in my mind that sort of drove the discovery of folk art in this first phase had all to do with a kind of inwardness that American art was experiencing at the time. And the inwardness was born of a kind of a pushback against an art history that seemed to always ground itself in a European experience. And these Americans were quite interested in trying to locate that elsewhere, locate it within our own borders. And they were also interested in framing something that could be identified as American and representative of the so-called melting pot America that they'd learned about in school. They also were interested in breaking this inevitable tie that was always made to European models and European precedents and find something where they could be first in line. And they also needed to find a way to stabilize their own experiments as artists and the work that they produced that was of an experimental sort, to stabilize it with something that the American public could relate to and which would compel the public to not dismiss out of hand the things that they were doing in their own studios. Now, I'll give you a perfect example. Flashback 3 or 4 slides here to that weather vane that I said, ready, set, go. It's just a flat silhouette cut out of a piece of old rusted sheet iron. And yet, if you look at that through a modernist lens, is it not just like those wonderful contour drawings of Picasso and Matisse? So we could go there. And I think the early American modernists realized this, and so they found an affection for those very simple weather vanes because they saw them, as the artists of the time liked to say, as drawings in space. And so we have a connection then, and we have the outrigger in place. But we also have some support here. Because for an audience that was very circumspect about all those weird things that Picasso and them were doing in Europe, you could say, look, a regular blacksmith that never went to school made this weather vane, and it's just like that Picasso. How can you hate the Picasso if you love the weather vane? And herein was this little rejoinder, this little defense that could be set up, where folk art could become an ally, and it could plug our utility infielder in to stabilize the ship. And here's the stuff that they found. This is a wonderful cross-section, and I can tell you, one of the things that was attractive about the project here at Columbus was that years ago, the Garbish family, Colonel and Mrs. Garbish, who lived on the eastern shore of Maryland, but both had Midwest roots, when they died, left their folk art collection to about 6 Midwestern art museums, and we were one of the 6. So when I signed on here, a lot of the material in section 1 here was already here. It hadn't been shown much, and the Garbishes were just kind of historic figures that people didn't remember much about. But we dusted it all off and brought it out right away, and I believe the first or second show that Nanette and I did here was an homage to the Garbishes, and there were 2 reasons. One, it was a good excuse to bring the stuff up and look at it again, and it was a great way to talk about the power and the importance of patronage from a museum perspective. Without the Garbish gift, my job would have been much more difficult, and it wouldn't have had the very important and quite wonderful anchor that it had when I first signed on in 2007. And what we have is an interesting spread here. Here's a seascape out of New England. Here's a Pennsylvania fractor, which is just a watercolor drawing. Here's a schoolgirl still life that was done probably in New England. The portrait over there, of course, this is one of the members of the Clark family. We found the whole Clark family in our basement here, and they'd acquired these pictures in 1941, the year that I was born. And they'd sort of been in the basement ever since. And with a little tender, loving care at a conservation lab, these things came back, and those of you familiar with the programming here know that we have showcased the Clarks a number of times, and in fact got great press the first time we showed them because we found a surviving descendant of the Clark family who came here on a weekend and told us the stories of the family and what he had heard or remembered of these people who lived up just north of Worthington and had a farm up there. The walking sticks we acquired after the walking stick show. The shaker chair we'll speak about in a minute. And interestingly, the portrait of Mr. Taggart, who was probably a tailor or could have been an architect, is on the far side there, and that was painted by a woman whose last name was Shute, one of the only females that we know from the 19th century who was a portrait artist of real stature and of real accomplishment. In some ways a better artist, maybe more skilled artist than whoever it was that painted the Clark family. But anyway, we inherited all of this, and so it was a great trove to be able to walk into and to use as an endpoint or an initial hook for the collection we were going to build. So in the simple handmade tools, toys, stitchery, pictures, landscape paintings, weather vanes, and portraits and trade signs. produced in frontier America, the 19th century. Certain early American modern artists discovered straightforward styles of art that they called folk art. Artists such as Kuniyoshi, Sheeler, Jacob Lawrence, Nadelman, all found the formal simplicity and distinctive American style of their nation's pre-industrial crafts and grassroots art to be both a source and an inspiration for their own vanguard, modernism. So here's the light bulb. There's the hands reaching, and there's some of the stuff that the hands reached out to. Inventing new marks and discovering fresh touchstones, Charles Sheeler. Sheeler was smitten with the crafts of the Shaker people, and he lived in an area of Pennsylvania where there were nearby Shaker settlements. He was fascinated by the level of craft that these anonymous, or essentially anonymous craftsmen from that community were able to generate. The furniture, the hat boxes. And so early on we acquired this wonderful Ohio Shaker chair, which you see that some Shaker furniture shows up in the Charles Sheeler picture that we have in our collection. And he was a great collector of this stuff in his Doylestown home. It was festooned with Shaker furniture and boxes as well as hooked rugs. He drew innumerable studies and sketches of Shaker barns because he thought that in their purity, which was their simplicity and their impeccable manufacture, the Shakers were meticulous craftspeople whose barns really stood the test of time and stayed strong, true, and clean against the sky. And clean is important here because, as you know, Sheeler later became known as a precisionist for the very precise way in which he would render even something like the sketch of the silo that he's working on over there. So Sheeler found what he needed to find and set the outrigger in place to support what it was that he did, much in the same way that Nadelman had. And so here we have Nadelman posed with one of his sculptures. We have a fine example of his work in the collection here. The light bulb goes off and he collects all kinds of folk art. He collected this, not this one. Oh, by the way, there's codes in all of these little sketches I'm doing. If the object is in color, we own it here in the museum. If it's in black and white, it's typical of the kinds of things that the artist was interested in, or actually in some cases things that the artist actually owned. So Sheeler was interested in Southern pottery. He was interested in these wig stands and these haberdashery heads that were carved for display objects in the front of millinery stores where they sold women's clothing and so forth. He was interested in weather vanes for the reasons we described earlier, and he was fascinated with toys. Toys for many of the early American modernists was a reinforcement for that idea of folk art as speaking to the innocence of childhood. True or not, this was a belief that sort of drove this community to collecting. We certainly talk about the importance that childhood and childhood memories had for someone like Alexander Calder. Well, it had the same appeal for the American modernists also, and so they loved collecting toys. Now, Nadelman, as I said, went on to open this museum, and here he is with his wife. What I thought was interesting in this shot, which shows how very Victorian the world was even at that time, here's some wonderful weather vanes in this little vignette where they're seen through the arches. Here's some toys, a whole spade of them in a display case. Here's some tools in another display case, and some Pennsylvania and European ironwork done by blacksmiths, all of which was voraciously collected by Nadelman, who had thousands of works of folk art in his collection by the time it was all said and done. And so he and his wife did open this up to the public, which was probably a good move in the sense that it allowed this collection to speak to a public which was probably having a hard time with some of the modern art that Nadelman himself was producing in his own studio. And yet when you set it against a backdrop of all this grassroots material, it's sort of like, who can hate a weather vane? So how could you hate a Nadelman? And I think it's rather shrewd, and I think in many ways the simplicity and the directness of this 19th century material was attractive to these artists precisely for the simplicity of form that it had, which they understood as abstraction. And so here was the gateway for abstract art in the United States. Interestingly, the gateway was folk art. Jacob Lawrence was not so much a collector of things as he was a collector of experiences. But he found in the world around him, in Harlem, New York, in the street life, a kind of a folk community that became a center of his work. And the picture that we have upstairs, which is kind of a bird's eye peek inside of a house of prostitution, you know, feeds off of a couple of things. It feeds off of that idea that there's wisdom, power, beauty, and integrity in the street life of a community. But we also see the tilting of the planes here, the flattening of the imagery, as being the same kind of thing that the other early modernists were finding in those weather vanes and in the simple folk pictures like the landscape that we saw with that sailing ship, the Cordelia. The space in the picture of the Cordelia, which is upstairs, is the same space that we find in Lawrence's picture over here. So I definitely include this artist because he made remarks, again, that were complimentary about folk art, and he was also represented by Edith Gregor Halpert, who was the same dealer that represented Charles Sheeler, and Edith Gregor Halpert went on, of course, to be the advisor for the forming of the folk art collection at Williamsburg, the Abbey Aldrich Rockefeller folk art collection, which is legendary even into our own time. So this is all interconnected, and it's like a cat's cradle. Follow the strings, and you'll find it all crisscrosses over. Kuniyoshi I end with here as my example out of phase 1. There's the work, the boy and the bowl of fruit, boy stealing fruit, and there's the hand, the aspiration, the outreach because of the light bulb that goes off. And I did find, it's not a great picture, but there's the artist himself amidst some of his own folk art treasures. And he was an early member of that group of American modernists who all summered at the art colony up in Algonquin, Maine. And they all would travel on the weekends around to yard sales and antique shops throughout New England, but mostly in Maine. And they'd buy up folk art and bring it home and decorated the cabins that they lived in during their residencies at this summer camp. And so the whole Algonquin camp became a kind of a mini museum of folk art, regional folk art to be sure, but the stuff that these people were finding was stuff that was feeding their ideas and inspiring their own art. And it's not hard to see here in Boy Stealing Fruit, the way the planes are tilted up in the same way that the Jacob Lawrence floor is tilted up in that house of prostitution, and the same way that everything is flattened, and the way the proportions are a little bit wacky. The hands are tiny and the arms are kind of pudgy. These liberties that seem to have been taken with the human form here are deliberate efforts on Kuniyoshi's part to sort of emulate what he saw as that childlike, fresh seeing that was manifest everywhere in the folk art that he collected. So he was fond of toys, he was fond of portraits. There are a number of pictures of him, by the way, posed with a duck decoy, that he collected these hunting artifacts because he thought that the purity of the form went far beyond Audubon in representing American waterfowl, migrating waterfowl. And so there are pictures of him with a duck decoy on the table next to him, and he's in his apartment in New York, and he's dressed to the nines, but here on the coffee table is a wonderful anonymous duck decoy. Phase 2, mid-century modernists rethink Marx, cultural identity, and art. Now, I consider myself really a member of this group, both as an artist and as an individual. I'm born in the time frame because after World War II and up into the 80s, there was a group of American modernists who actually took a quite different view of what they would call folk art and celebrate a different set of forms to a different end in the work that they themselves were producing. So now these photographs, by the way, are composites. I tricked them up with Photoshop. And so it doesn't lay out exactly like this upstairs. It's actually in 2 rooms. You have to go around a divider wall to get from there to here. But I set it up as a panorama once again so you could understand that on your left, this is the story that's being told. And the story begins with Arnold, Blanch, and Doris Lee over there in the 30s and the 40s and works its way right on up through Wilde and David Hostetler over here and Peter Gorfain in the 1970s. Now, I knew some of these artists personally, especially William King and Peter Gorfain, both friends of mine. But there's an interesting, I talked about the cat's cradle, and the stories go on, and I'll not give you too many of them now, but suffice to say this is worth recounting. William King, who you probably know from the big flat cutout of an adult reaching down for a child that was out on the museum grounds. It's part of our collection here. It's been here forever. But Bill is better known actually for these figures that he made out of vinyl and burlap and so forth, and he stitched them up on a sewing machine, and he mounted them on wire armatures that he just twisted and put together with twist ties, and he didn't even weld these things, but he made these wonderful sort of cartoonish figures, which are always kind of bemusedly looking out and sort of considering the world. And the figure in that little vitrine, Pat and I owned this for years, and it lives here now, and it should, because this is Bill in his classic way of sort of responding to folk art. And this is an artist who knew about Elijah Pierce and knew about Edgar Tolson, but here's the significant story. Bill, who was originally from Florida, went to New York as a young man to study art at Cooper Union. And a phone call came into the switchboard at Cooper Union one day, and a woman named Viola Nadelman was looking for an enterprising young sculpture student who might come up to her home and help her sort through the collection that she and her husband had assembled. And her husband had been dead for 10 years, and she was trying to figure out what they had left and what this was as an inventory. And Bill King went up and took that job, and he worked with her then for the next 6 months, digging through everything from the carousel figures to the Cubie dolls to the head mannequins that were in the collection, and helped her organize and notate all of the material that was in their folk art collection. So we positioned this Bill King sort of to be looking out across the room toward the Nadelman, which is 15, 20 feet away, because there again is a connection. But the connection is, of course, folk art, which is on the opposite wall, but it's also between generations of these artists. And in our phase two, we find two generations of artists. You find Bill King's generation, and you find my generation. And of the people from the younger group, you've got Peter Gorfain and David Hostetler, actually, who taught sculpture down here at Ohio University in Athens forever. Great fan of Nadelman's, but who collected folk art and had little folk art objects that he'd find in flea markets and yard sales all around Athens, Ohio, had them all over his studio, and they were sort of sources and inspirations for his work. So the label copy here will delineate all of the connections to be discussed, and we're going to get to some of those in the profiles that we're going to present here. Again, three things that these two generations were after. They sought to define modern American art as reflecting the growing racial and sectional pluralism of a nation that they saw more as a tossed salad than as a melting pot. And this is an important distinction, because these people were finding folk art that was being made by people who were their contemporaries, still alive and well, people with names, biographies, and faces. And they liked the fact that this energy and this sort of populist reinforcement for ideas that they were chasing in their own studios was abroad in the land. And so they liked the energy of a living folk society or a living folk culture. You could call it a popular culture that surrounded them with mark makers of a quite different sort than those that the first generation had looked for, which was looking backwards, in a sense, into the 19th century to recover a certain vision of Americana that was a stable platform for their new modernism. That being said, that modernism was in place by the time the second and third generations came along, and they wanted another kind of energy and another kind of permission to be granted by the material that they were going to call folk art. So they developed representational styles of narrative art, people like Bill King, that would push back against what had become the hegemony of abstraction in that time. And they experimented with art gestures grounded in the fast-paced new American popular culture, gestures that would challenge high art and its traditional association with elite culture. So here's the folk art these people were after, and it's quite different, as you can see, in form and feeling than the material that the garbage heads had collected from phase one. So, a diverse aggregation of living rural and urban folk artists that they idealized and grouped together under the label self-taught artists. Many academically trained artists from that period collected and venerated the work that was in this broader popular culture, and they did so because it signaled what they saw as the vitality, creativity, and the originality of grassroots America. So here's the light bulb, here's the hands reaching out, and here's the stuff. And it's quite a different look. It's quite a different feel. And most of this material was artists who were either living or had been vital living figures in a slightly earlier time, and their legacy was still one of a living community. We got Grandma Moses up there. We've got Charlie Walletto from the Southwest here. He was a Navajo medicine man who made these interesting dolls. Bill King would have loved this roadside sign of a tin man advertising a sheet metal shop. Mary Borkowski in Dayton, Ohio, who made what she called thread pictures, these wonderful narrative pieces that she did, all in silk with gold and colored yarns that were woven, not woven, but stitched and sewn together to create these pictures, which were then stuffed like quilts from the back side and mounted on flatboards to become pictures. The Amish quilts were found at that time, and again, the abstraction in these things was appealing to artists, again, looking for not a refutation of abstraction as such, but a humanizing of abstraction, which was not difficult to do when you could have wonderful works like this quilt. And here in Columbus, Ohio, the discovery of Elijah Pierce, 3 blocks away up on Long Street, was a gigantic breakthrough. And this museum was prescient enough to move on this and to stay with this. And my last show on Elijah Pierce really documents that whole history. And I'm proud to say, from the very beginning, in about 1971-72, when Pierce was being discovered by basically a group of students from over at the art school, and by people at Ohio State, and by people in the community who were art-aware people. Now, this is not to say that Elijah Pierce was unknown, but he was known within the black community. And he was known as Reverend Pierce, and these things served a certain function within that community. His marks had utility. And you can call it an art utility, you can call it a social utility, you can call it a spiritual utility within that community. But the works were appropriated in the 70s to a broader utility, which had some connection then to more standard texts that are about modern art. And so Pierce was shown here in 72, and he was shown here over and over again. And at each circle, this spread and widened, and this community, the museum, met his community and met him, and even after he passed away, this museum acquired the contents of the barber shop, the art and everything else, and the barber chair. And this all became a part of a history that lives here. And then in our last efforts were to fill in certain pieces of his oeuvre that were missing through the years, and to try to have the most balanced and comprehensive representation of this very great artist in the archives and in the vaults of this museum. So that, in fact, has been achieved, and it's an effort that can't be repeated, and it's an outcome that can't reside anywhere else but in the Columbus Museum of Art. So, making new marks and finding new touchstones. And here's the people. These are the Modernists. This is Doris Lee. She was interested in folk art from the start. She loved Grandma Moses, obviously. That's Doris's picture up in the corner there. Here's Doris, and she's reaching out for the inspiration. And she is interested in artists like Horace Pippin, an African-American who did some interesting peeks inside his World War I experience as a soldier and his own experience living in a neighborhood in Philadelphia. John Kane. We have, of course, the portrait here of his wife. And you're all familiar with that wonderful picture of the steelworker with his hands on his hips that's at the Museum of Modern Art. That's John's self-portrait, and this is the portrait of his wife, Maggie. This is Fred Papsdorf. Fred was he was basically a dispatcher for the Borden Milk Company in Detroit, and he painted at night. And Doris and her partner, Arnold Blanch, discovered Papsdorf's work after it was shown at the Museum of Modern Art, and they became great fans of his work. This particular picture here, which at one point lived in the home of Diane Barone, who's sitting right out there, is an important piece for us because this is actually one of the paintings that was in his debut at the Museum of Modern Art. And so Doris and Arnold went on an effort to sort of gather the stories and tell the stories of these artists. And what they found out about Fred is wonderful, that he'd come home and eat dinner after work, and then he'd go up to his studio, which was one of his bedrooms that had been converted into a little painting room. And he would paint these still lifes, and he often would create these still lifes. He'd gather some fresh flowers, around his house or on his way home from work, and he'd hold them in his left hand, and he'd look at them, and he'd paint them with his right hand. And I think this is just a fabulous mental image, isn't it? To find this dispatcher from Board and Milk making these wonderful still lifes that have a very interesting sort of magic to them, and that's why he was included in the Magic Realist show in 1944. And so Doris and Arnold actually wrote a book called Painting for Enjoyment. And this is, again, a measure, in the same way that Nadelman set up a museum, Doris and Arnold wrote this book, and it was really to try to extend an idea of art and art making. Mark making that could be art making to a broad American community in the popular culture. And so that's why it's called Painting for Enjoyment. And from page 1, they say, you don't have to be trained in an art academy to be an artist. You don't have to have been trained to be able to do a perfect Michelangelo rendering to be able to enjoy making art and feel accomplishment and feel the creativity of your own self in the work that you undertake. Just do it. And so the just do it message was implicit and explicit for them in the works that they celebrated in the book. And so here's a Morris Hirschfeld, here's a Horace Pippin, here's a 19th century still life. And note, they're marrying, in a sense, the phase 2 affection for living folk artists and self-taught artists with a respect for some of the lessons that Kuniyoshi and them were finding in the earlier works that we inherit here at the museum in the garbage collection. So this still life with a watermelon on the table is interestingly close to the one that we have. And these were produced by schoolgirls who were learning the domestic arts in their finishing schools. This would make them good citizens, good wives, and good people within a very gender stratified society of the 19th century. And one of the ongoing problems in America, of course, is the identification of the arts with femininity, and the problem that artists like Jackson Pollock had with this designation, and their struggle, at least at mid-century, to try and make it a proper male occupation. That's another story. I just think it's interesting that Doris and Arnold were able to reach across time and space and fold in everything that had gone before with what it was that they were doing. So this is their book. Here's Bill King. There he is at the bottom putting a hat on one of his vinyl figures. There's the bronze that's here. He's reaching out, and he reaches out to an interesting cross-section of folk and self-taught art productions. Silhouette pictures, of course, I told you he was very interested in Tolson. He was interested in roadside signage, and he was interested in assemblage. All of Bill's work comes out of the same tradition that David Smith comes out of found object constructions, and that is making something out of a bunch of something else's. In other words, finding discard and rubble, and through the artist's transformative genius or transformative ability, to be able to switch that up and turn it into something else, and let that something else live within our imaginations as art. And finally, Peter Gorfain was very interesting because, again, as a late modernist, he too has an interest in primitive art, but the primitive art he's interested in is American folk art of a certain sort, and then he reaches back to Europe also and gets interested in Celtic things. He gets interested in Romanesque sculpture and Romanesque friezes. I think there's one down here, yes, with the figures and the human beings, you know, all brought together in these skeins of narrative that read kind of like very embroidered and embellished comic strips, and he produces wonderful graphics like this and fabulous pieces of pottery with friezes like this that go the full ways around on the pot. He was actually artist in residence at OSU for about a year, and he created 6 or 7 huge ceramic jars. They're about this big, and he made them in the kiln room at the pottery up there. And they fired them, but of course somebody figured out after he got them out of the kiln when they were fired, they were too big to get out the door of the kiln room. So they had to take the door apart and take out part of the wall to get Peter's wonderful large ceramic vessels out of there. And I think the administration at OSU was much vexed at all the inconvenience that Peter brought to their programming. On the other hand, we can't forget what wonderful things he created and what was generating, what impulses were generating all this inside him as he worked. So this is an odd mix of artists, isn't it, from Nadelman to Gorfain. Nadelman's famous, Gorfain you probably haven't heard of until today, but all of them in this mix and all of them finding these touchstones in self-taught art. Warhol, of course, pops into this also, and you may or may not know that he was a rather rabid folk art collector, and so he was interested in the folk art that crossed over into popular culture. These optician signs from the 19th century are a big deal for him, as were carousel horses, but at the same time, Coca-Cola bottles and cigar store Indians. The photo up here is rather rare, and I use it even though he's tiny in the image that we've set up here. He's seen amidst a bunch of his collections, some of which includes furniture and funky things, and I don't know, a large elk head or a moose head, a taxidermy specimen that he bought at a flea market somewhere. But he was an inveterate collector because he just loved that touch to the earth, if you will, or to popular or common culture. And this, of course, was one of the things that distinguished his art and caused his art to be so revolutionary in his time. And just to back this up, early on, Andy Warhol's folk art collection was actually shown at the Museum of American Folk Art. I saw the show. I can assure you this is his stuff. And here's the cover of his catalog with Andy peeking out the door of a Gothic doorway with an arch over. And here's some sample pages from in that catalog showing what it was that that museum brought together. And Warhol actually served several terms on the board of the Museum of American Folk Art in New York City. So here's some interesting sidebars that, again, talk about the complexity and the intricacy of this as a cultural structure. Finally, we move into phase 3, our present moment. And here's the entirety of phase 3, which we'll view in the gallery. And what were these people doing? What was folk art? What is folk art in the present moment? And I think it's worth noting that, in general, they define art making as a form of a kind of social practice generated for a culture defined by seemingly endless diversity. So we went from the melting pot to the tossed salad, and now we just go to this enormous collage of people and races and identities scattered all across the globe, and that is the mark of globalism that factors in as the glue and at the same time the explosive in our contemporary culture. They want their own art marks to express their own lived identity as individuals in a shared world, and they expect their art activity to address power asymmetries. Now, here's the folk art that comes to the front of the screen and heads to the front of the line in the current moment. And most of this material has been added in the last 10 years to the collection here because there was every effort to offset and balance the early collection of the garbage material and the classic material with the more experimental identity-based art that seems to be the definition of folk art or outsider art, as they like to call it, in our present time. So today's version of folk art focuses on idiosyncratic marks produced by outsiders, incarcerated prisoners, women, ethnic minorities, members of the LGBT community, people with disabilities, and groups and individuals marginalized in our contemporary society. Now, this is a caveat. Though calling such work folk art is arguably problematic, marks made by creative people living outside the mainstream have found resonance within an evolving vision of folk art. And contemporaries like Amina Robinson, Thomas Lanigan Schmidt, and Louis Tapia all admired and collected marks made by markers stubbornly asserting their own unique humanity. Now, here's the light bulb, and notice the light bulbs have changed through our phases. But the hands still reach out, but different stuff is sort of the object of desire here, isn't it? And so we have Martin Ramirez's work down here. Ramirez was a diagnosed paranoid schizophrenic, lived out his days in a mental institution in California, and he drew incessantly in his room, his /cell, where his work was discovered by the art world and ultimately came to be first understood as very strange, inward, indecipherable marks by a madman, which since have, I think, been tamed and absorbed by our art community as much more than that. The problem is it was probably we who were the outsiders, not Ramirez. He was from Mexico. He came to this country as a young man. He made his living as a field worker in California until he was imprisoned in the asylum. He chose not to speak, and so they declared him either mute or crazy, and then he spent his days making these things. But there's so much Mexican tradition here. There's so much of the graphic tradition of the Southwest in this material. It's sort of hard to believe that they missed it the first time around. But and again, this idea of Martin Ramirez, the bracero, as an outsider, makes this work compelling, and the narrative around it very compelling for the art of our time. Stephen Anderson lives in the same house he was born in, north of Chicago. He lives in the house with his brother and his sister. Their mother used to live there with them until she passed away. It is indeed a curious family. Pat and I went to visit Stephen and did find the whole afternoon to be most engaging and most unique. And I can tell you, Stephen's work is fabulous. Here's his homage to Tesla, right, the inventor, the eccentric inventor. I think Stephen identifies with that. And in the background are some of the experiments and the experimental electric stations that he built to prove some of his theories. And yet he lived in the Waldorf, or one of the big hotels in New York City, and every afternoon he had a habit of going into the park and feeding pigeons. He loved pigeons. And so the veranda or the balcony outside his room, I guess, at the hotel was also a feeding station and attracted pigeons by the gazillions all the time. And so Stephen, of course, set the little pigeon over there over what would be Tesla's right shoulder as a reminder of this other characteristic of his eccentric idol. Here's a quilt from a later, not so much a later period, but a quilt that would come into our consciousness in a later period, an African-American quilt, a strip quilt so-called, where the designs, of course, are much freer, more eccentric, using more found objects than is typical of the earlier Amish quilts that we looked at. And this work gets a second look in the third go-around and becomes powerful in reinforcing this idea of personal self and outsiderness that lives in period 3. The idiom also expands to include photographs, these works of Eugene von Brunschenheim, who quite frankly thought his wife was the most beautiful person in the world, great basis for a great marriage. And he took her picture all the time, clothed and unclothed, and then he printed them all and he had them all around the house. And we received a gift from the estate of the von Brunschenheim family, and this was facilitated by Duff, sitting right here in the front row. And it was important that these come to this museum and that they come to do several things. These are useful to our photography department as photographs as such, but they're extremely important to our folk art area because they cross over into this business of the self-expression, the marks made by people who don't necessarily think of themselves as artists, but who become artists in this collective conversation that frames all of this as time moves forward. And so, Duff, we do appreciate this, and you'll see that actually the exhibition goes out on this note. This is the next step in the last phase, which certainly doesn't close anything. It actually opens a lot of doors. And equally interesting is this prison clock. Again, something that was brought to us by Tom Dowdge sitting in the back row there. And Tom called us and said, I found something that looks like it wants to come to the museum. And it was a clock that was made by a prisoner in a prison in Illinois. And we did some research here, and we never could find out who made this thing, but we found out a lot about this warden for whom this thing was made. And it's all dedicated to the warden, and it has all of these symbols of incarceration in high relief stretched all through this thing with the two outside turrets that frame Joliet Prison in Illinois. And yet, on top of the clock is a prisoner in his striped suit, and in very bright raised letters below it, it says, both doing time, meaning the prisoner and his keeper are really both the same. They're both kept and they're both closed down and locked away from society. And this speaks to a kind of stereotype of the idea of the outsider, but it also speaks to what we like to imagine art as being able to do, and that is reveal something of the interior of the artist maker, and that revealed something connects to something in the artist consumer, the artist audience, that finds the thing and finds a place for it in the larger lexicon of art. So again, the patrons have been so important in what we've been able to do here, and the sensibilities that everything that comes in the door represent, is so rich and varied to give us new touchstones for the art makers of our time. And so we talk about Amina Robinson here. a person who started out really quite inward about her own art being stimulated and reinforced by her life in the community of Poindexter Village, where she had lived for most of her youth. And she found Elijah Pierce at a certain point along the way, and there was a connection there, and I think she began to understand herself as an artist differently and perhaps better, you know, through the interaction with Mr. Pierce. So we put him in here as one of the focuses of her outreach. And then she began to be interested in her own genealogy. And as you know, for an awful lot of African Americans, finding the documentation for a family tree is very difficult. She had some difficulty with it also, but she did find out that she could trace her roots back to the Sea Islands off the coast of Georgia. This is where the Geechee and the Gullah people live, and have lived for centuries. They were all brought there as slaves, and many, you know, continue to live and procreate on the islands in a community that's forever been kind of closed. And she went to the islands and began to visit people and hear the stories from the elders and learn more about the core essence of their existence on the island. And that led her to understand that almost everyone that was deposited on those islands had come from West Africa, so she went to Africa. And so at each step, you see like a stone thrown into a pond, it ripples outward for Amina. And so she becomes interested in the fabric dolls of the people of West Africa. And she goes to the villages and she gets interested in their weavings, and she gets interested in the basket making from the islands, and she's interested in the Ashanti people of West Africa. That's a Bambara antelope over there. And some of the folk paintings from the islands, Mr. Pierce, and especially those fabric and bric-a-brac assembled dolls that are part and parcel of the culture that moves from Africa across the Middle Passage and into the New World. So I think here we begin to see the crossover not entirely being about objects per se, but of identity as it moves. And this is one of the keys, or one of the hallmarks for this third phase, is that the fine art, the modern art inquiry, in the name of self-expression, starts to move into arenas where it isn't just about flatness and cubism and some of the more important early formal arguments, but the less formal and more idiosyncratic arguments that have to do with art as self. And so Michael Nolan is, again, exemplary of all of this. This man is an avid folk art collector. He's interested in all the artists that you see here. Here's some of his work on this side. The outreach, of course, going out to Ramirez, who he's fond of, Hawkins, who he knew personally and is very fond of, Elijah Pierce, also Popeye Reed, who he was probably Popeye's biggest booster, and Stephen Anderson, who he actually was the curator for in a recent exhibition at the Inuit Gallery in Chicago. They had a retrospective exhibition of Stephen's work. This is Stephen down here. This is Stephen's self-portrait, surrounded by little bits of memorabilia from his whole career as a self-taught artist, and walls of these wonderful things that he's created over the years. And Nolan, I would say, is probably as big a booster as Stephen Anderson has got. And in an interesting way, this self-taught artist, this isolated, you know, rather eccentric person living, you know, in Illinois, actually in Rockford, has a website. So you can visit Stephen Anderson if you just want to look him up on your devices. And finally, well, not finally, next to last, we find Luis Tapia. And again, when we're talking about the broadening of this inquiry, and the broadening not only of the audience, but a broadening of the sensibilities that are being folded into an idea of folk art, we find that the regions of the country become important now, and as does ethnicity. And Luis is, of course, Hispanic, and he lives in Santa Fe. And he started out life as a carver of Santos material, the traditional icons that go into the churches, some of which are strongly native in their decor, some of which are very strongly Spanish colonial in their appearances. But he went into this work and became a restorer in this community and was fixing all these old carvings from the 18th and 17th century. And then he went to Los Angeles to do some repair work on some figures in a church, and he met the fine artist Luis Jimenez, who was really an activist and very strong in the Chicano art movement of the 70s and the 80s. And Luis became converted, he became enthralled, he became a sort of a protege of Luis. And he came back to Santa Fe and he started making some really tough, powerful work that absorbs his ethnic tradition, his folk art grounding, if you will, but runs it through the lens of third phase modernism. And this piece over here, which is called Abuela, which means grandmother, is in the exhibition upstairs. We just acquired 2 pieces by Luis, and I think he's a wonderful artist to have in our collection, somebody who really is, you know, a third phase modernist and who brings all of those third phase issues that we talked about when we ran through the little checklist there into his work. And finally, there's Thomas Lanigan Schmidt, and this artist I didn't know anything about before this piece walked in the door to one of our Committee on Collections meetings. And this is the piece we're talking about over here with an interesting, elaborate title about the proletarian view of late constructivism. And this is Tom here. He has a number of interesting videos about himself on YouTube, and you can watch them at home. But what's interesting is that this is an artist who was actually at the Stonewall riot. He's openly gay, and he openly dismisses and trivializes high art every time he gets a chance. He said, good taste is the last resort of people with no imagination. And I think that sort of sums it up. I saw that on one of his tapes. But here he is, and he's holding this bust of Bart Simpson, which he found somewhere. And he has a whole house full of what he calls knickknacks that he's accumulated along the way, these touchstones to popular culture, popular American culture that sort of feed his art. This paper mache Bart Simpson is modeled over an actual human skull. So how odd is this, right? And this becomes one of the talismans, one of the little touchstones that Tom keeps in his studio to sort of remind him who he is. And so we got Bart over here, and then we can't overlook the fact that not only does Stonewall leave a mark on his worldview, but the fact that he was raised Catholic and remains, I think, nominally Catholic. He was an altar boy. And so the Eucharist is very central in his understandings, and you'll see that as this sort of pop culture homage to the Eucharist run through what he calls a kind of tinfoil constructivism. And this is an amazing artist with a great sense of self who's bringing the richness and the complexity of his own identity into the art that he makes, and all of it grounded in a world where the art that feeds his art is really the art of life. And I don't know how a curator at this point moves further forward with a modernism that's moving in this direction in terms of what we would acquire, but we'll figure it out. And this, of course, becomes the job of my successors here at the museum. So here we are, folk, marks and markers, figures and grounds, forests and trees. Enjoy this exhibition. And here's a piece of folk art foregrounded, a Martin Ramirez, against some third phase modernism as the backdrop collage. And I would note in closing that we, you and I, complete the art. Our folk art infielders, however, have decidedly added enrichment and excitement to the roster of art marks that define and declare our modern experience. I thank you. And this has been a joyous experience. I just want to say for the record, working here and I've been a collector since I was a little kid, but collecting for yourself and your own enjoyment is one thing, collecting for an institution is another. And having an opportunity here to take my experience at gathering stuff and put it in the service of other agendas and other projects and other representations within the fabric of a community has been new for me, but also very gratifying. And I would like to just take a moment here to do 2 things. One, of course, I extend you also the thanks of the infielders who are on this with us, the people who are going to visit when we go upstairs. But also, I would like to do 2 quick things that will close out my time here. The first is to click the last slide away and have the screen brought up and share something with you, if we could. for you and you alone. The debut of the latest gift that's come into our folk art collection. This is an unbelievably wonderful Ralph Fasanella from 1948. And this comes to us as a very complex gift from the artist's son, Mark, the Hill Gallery in Birmingham, Michigan, which kind of brokered the whole deal, and the Kohler Foundation in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. Mark offered the picture. The Hills pointed him to us, and we made the connection. And then Mark reached out to the Kohler Foundation, which now supports in its program of philanthropy a project that repairs and restores works of art for museums at no cost to the museum, but just to be a part of the chain of moving things from disrepair into the real world in pristine condition. This painting had been in a flood in Ralph's basement at one point in time, and there was some water damage on the lower, maybe 3 or 4 inches of the picture. Nothing drastic, but it had distorted the canvas and a little bit of the paint was peeling and flaking. So the picture had been kind of off to the side because nobody wanted to really, go there. But actually, once the Kohler people were contacted, they said, sure, find a good restoration lab, which we did, found a lab in Detroit, and had it shipped out. And they brought this picture back. It's been relined, and you see it now as it would have appeared in the late 40s when Ralph first exhibited it. Now, let me give you a bit of the background. Ralph was a political activist and a lefty all of his life. And he was a socialist, he was maybe borderline communist. He was always for workers' rights, and he was very strident, and his work is typically sort of political. On the other hand, he had a brother who was kind of the opposite, a guy who just kind of wanted to be left alone and live a tranquil, sort of rural, maybe even secluded life off in the woods somewhere. Now, both of them were auto mechanics. And Ralph worked in a garage and in jobs that had him in the middle of New York City all the time, fixing people's cars and fixing anything that needed fixing. And his brother Sam ran a little gas station, but always dreamed of being able to leave the city behind and move out onto Long Island into a wooded area where he could be alone with nature and live this sort of idealized life of seclusion that he had in his mind as his perfect place. So this picture is called Sam's Dream. That's Sam's gas station up there in the upper left-hand corner. This is Ralph's gas station down in the middle of the picture. And so he's given his brother his ideal place, the woods and the birds and a beautiful sunset and this idealized rustic existence. And yet Ralph couldn't stop himself from sort of like putting front and center the world he really liked. And these are all cutaways peeking inside apartments in busy cosmopolitan New York City where, as Ralph says, there's a picture in every window. There's a story behind every window shade. And so he's got a lot of those little narratives threaded through here in the immediate surround of his own gas station. And then what we find here is the freedom and the freshness of his style of painting and the flatness and all the abstraction that we associate even with Phase 1 folk art collecting. And yet Ralph was very strident about all of this and told an interviewer at one point in time, I may paint flat, but I don't think flat. Does it get any better? Do I need to say anything more? But anyway, this Fasanella now joins the collection here. I'm sorry it got here too late to be in the show, but this begins the next step, doesn't it? And shows you the ways in which this collection moves forward and affirms for you, if I haven't made the point already today, how important all of you benefactors are and what it is that you really have facilitated here and why this museum is not an island and why it needs that community underscoring, that community push, that community patronage that makes it work, keeps it vital, and keeps it moving in its time and for its time and beyond. So enjoy your new Fasanella and think about maybe some of the stuff we talked about today as you do that in the future. But one last thing. I'd like to ask my boss to come up for a minute. And I have a little something here. This is just me being trouble again.
Okay, so now this is the big kind of, oh, I have my mask on a little bit.
You'll
I'll
find.
stay 6 feet distance.
Oh,
no,
I
no,
can.
you have your mask on.
I can strap on the gear.
Trying to be correct.
Yeah, well, we shall. You already know from things that were said throughout, and certainly in Nanette's introduction, that we have a long and special relationship. And I'm here because she asked me to come here. It's that simple. I've stayed because she's been so supportive of everything that I dragged into this place behind me in this long laundry list of ideas and fixations that are mine, that somehow were modified and applied to be relevant and I hope effective here. I'm leaving, and it's a funny thing. But, as she said, I'm probably not gone. But
You're an official leader.
I've been in institutions, not that kind of institution, all my life. And the thing that has always been a little bothersome for me is this thing about institutional memory. Institutions have short memories, and legacies are fleeting things. I'm uncomfortable with that. I was uncomfortable with that when I left my university position, because I knew the erasures would start immediately. So we are trying to forestall an erasure here. And so I'm going to leave you something. You charged me with something, now I charge you. I sort of modified an old folk art walking stick to be what I would call the scepter for your folk art division. It has CMOA folk art at the top. It has my signature cut into the material below. It has a serpent, which pre-existed, of course. This is the found object part of it. But I thought it was an interesting metaphor for the idea of folk art in a museum. It's always underfoot. It can be a little bit lethal and certainly vexing all the time. And so, Nanette, I'm giving you this because you're still in charge. I want you to give it to the next curator, and don't forget, because this thing is here to bedevil you and to remind you that this is different. Curators come and curators go, but there should be a line here. And so it should be a kind of lineage, and I think this thing maybe becomes the glue that connects me to whoever comes next and to the people that will move this on into the future, because we have a great future. And you've done this. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. This is wonderful. and I think Nicole is still here, so Nicole will make sure that our registrar Nicole will make sure that it goes to a safe space, that we have it to pass along. This has been wonderful. Actually, I looked up while I was sitting back there, brought my phone this time. Michael started officially his role as adjunct curator in May of 2007. Again, his relationship with the Columbus Museum of Art goes well back to 1990, but he was in his official capacity, and we did, in those 13 years, we did 12 shows. It was a solid dozen, which is an amazing number of shows and projects to do during that time. So the 12 shows and the Burkhart book, and just an amazing number, and you're in the American Catalog book. And
everywhere.
You're everywhere. So a couple of things we're going to do. We're going to go upstairs. Do we get to keep the bag so it gets safe?
Of course,
of course. It has its little cloth bag. We're going to go up, and Michael, Nick is going to go with us, and we're going to do a little tour. So you can be in the space with Michael. You are welcome to join us if you are uncomfortable with that for any reason. Please feel free to. We're so grateful you joined us this far in the journey. And so that's the next stage. We were originally going to have a wonderful goodbye party for Michael, where we invited people from all over that are good friends of Michael's to come. We are going to do that. We are going to do that when it is safe to do that. What we're going to do in the interim is I'm working on a Zoom party that we will, at least we can gather virtually, we can talk to each other and toast Michael. So we will be doing that sometime in the next probably 30 days. But that we will follow it when it's safe to gather, so that all of us from around the country who have connections to Michael Hall can come and celebrate Michael probably, next spring or so, hopefully next spring or something.
On his 80th birthday.
When is that 80th birthday, Mike?
May 20th.
May 20th. We can combine we can combine the goodbye delay party with the 80th birthday party. We could do that. So that would be great. So we're off to the next thing.
Maybe,
so exciting.
Isn't that great?
This is just incredible. Lord, it is incredible.